Why was everyone missing the target that day? No one could say for sure, but the air at Camp Guernsey had a way of turning pride into silence. The wind there wasn't just weather, it was a living thing. It rolled off the plateau in wild, invisible waves, shoving bullets sideways, making grown men curse under their breath. By noon, the sun was white and merciless. The air shimmered. The dirt baked hard enough to burn through elbows and pride alike. A dozen ranger candidates lay flat behind their rifles, their scopes glinted, fingers tightened on triggers. Steel plates sat 1,600 yards out, small, cruel, and perfectly still. Each man waited for the same sound, a single, clear ping. None came. One by one they missed again, and again. Earlier there had been laughter, that easy kind that comes before failure sets in. Someone had bet a case of beer on who would hit first. Another joked about the wind being drunk. But the laughter had thinned out fast, replaced by the thick, bitter quiet that only missed shots can bring. Behind them, near the ammo shed, a small woman leaned on a broom. Her cap was faded, pulled low. Her boots were old but cared for. She swept the gravel slow, steady, like she had all the time in the world. Every few seconds her eyes flicked downrange, not at the targets, but at the shimmer above the rocks, the way heat twisted the air in thin silver ribbons. Nobody paid her much attention. She was just the maintenance lady, range support. The kind of person who fixed fences, filled sandbags, and made sure brass didn't pile up in the wrong places. The kind of person you thank out of politeness and forget 5 minutes later. Her name was Nora Delgado. Most of them didn't know that yet. Staff Sergeant Cole Riker did. He'd seen her around, always quiet, always moving like someone who didn't need to prove anything. He respected her work, but that was all. She wasn't part of his world. His world was on the firing line, training young rangers to read wind, hold discipline, and never make excuses. Riker was cut from the old cloth, squared away, hard as granite, his jaw perpetually tight. He'd earned his place through grit and had no patience for weakness. If his candidates were missing, they weren't working hard enough. It was that simple. He paced behind the line like a storm cloud, arms crossed, voice low but sharp. Check your dope, reconfirm wind calls, don't just guess, commit. But it didn't matter how much he barked. The wind didn't care about rank. Candidate Bird, one of the younger ones, was breathing hard behind his rifle. His cheek was pressed tight against the stock, sweat dripping down his neck. "Come on," he whispered to himself. "Just one hit." He squeezed. Crack. The shot echoed across the range. Silence, no ping. The round vanished somewhere into the Wyoming dust. Bird cursed under his breath, racked the bolt, and tried again. Same result. The plate might as well have been a ghost. "Wind's playing tricks today," someone muttered. Another laughed nervously. "Maybe the range is cursed." Riker turned, his voice cutting the air. "Focus." But focus wasn't the problem. Pride was. Pride and the kind of blind faith young soldiers put in digital screens. They had apps, solvers, charts, all the math in the world, yet none of it was saving them. Behind them, Nora leaned on the broom and watched the air shift over the ridge. The back flags, the ones the boys kept staring at, flapped steady. But halfway downrange, the shimmer danced left, then crawled right, like the wind had changed its mind mid-flight. She could see it clear as day. They couldn't. She knew that kind of blindness. She'd seen it before, the kind that comes when numbers matter more than instinct, when you forget to listen to the earth. Someone noticed her watching. Private Ramos, the loud one, always grinning, always talking, nudged his buddy. "Hey, maybe the broom lady's got some magic wind-reading skills, huh?" A few laughed. Another chimed in, "Maybe she can sweep the bullets straight." The laughter spread like it always does, light, cruel, and quick. Riker snapped, "Knock it off." Silence. The woman didn't react. She didn't frown, didn't smile either. She just shifted her grip on the broom and kept sweeping. Dust curled around her boots. Her face stayed unreadable, eyes still tracking that faint shimmer over the rocks. But if you looked close, really close, you'd notice her eyes weren't the eyes of a janitor. They were calculating, measuring, remembering. In her back pocket, a small, battered notebook stuck halfway out. The edges were taped, corners worn soft from years of use. Inside, lines of faded pencil marks, wind calls, ranges, holdovers, tiny arrows showing mirage angles. Old-school field notes. And on the back, laminated under scratched plastic, was a photo. Two soldiers on a barren ridge somewhere overseas. Dusty, tired, grinning. The young men on the line didn't know that yet. They just saw a broom. The next shot cracked out, another miss, then another. The plateau swallowed their frustration whole. Bird lifted his head, his voice low, defeated. "This is pointless, Sergeant. Win's impossible today." Riker's jaw tightened. "Win's never impossible, son. You're just not seeing it." But even he was starting to feel the sting. His candidates had burned through almost half their rounds, and not one had hit steel. Pride was crumbling faster than discipline. That's when Ramos spoke again, a little too loud this time. Hell, even the broom lady could probably do better. Laughter again. But it didn't last. Because that's when Nora spoke. Her voice was soft, rough like gravel. "Wind's got 3 steps today." The laughter stopped mid-breath. She didn't raise her tone, didn't look up, just spoke like someone talking to herself. "If you're reading the back flag only, you're blind." The candidates glanced at each other, confused. Riker turned, eyes hard. "We're good here, ma'am. Appreciate it, but the candidates have this under control." She didn't answer. She didn't look offended either, just nodded slightly and went back to watching the rocks. It should have ended there. But something shifted. Bird adjusted his rifle again, but his eyes weren't on the target anymore. They were on her. The calm way she stood, broom in hand, watching the range like it was telling her a story only she could hear. He noticed the tattoo on her wrist, a thin, faded feather curling just above the glove line. He frowned. That wasn't just any ink. That was a ranger mark. And then when he went to grab a water bottle, he saw it, the rifle case in the back of her old pickup truck. The thing looked ancient. Metal corners scuffed to silver, latches dull with age. Not the kind of gear maintenance crews carried. Bird didn't say anything, but he felt something, the faint pull of curiosity. When he came back to his rifle, the broom lady was flipping through that notebook again, fingers tracing old numbers. One of the other candidates caught a glimpse. "Hey, that looks like a sniper's dope book," he whispered. "Bullshit," someone muttered, but he looked too, and then another did. The murmurs spread. Not laughter this time, quiet question, small realizations. Who was she? Riker didn't notice the whispers. He was too busy fighting frustration. Every miss felt like a hit to his pride. He stopped packing finally, his boots grinding the gravel as he turned toward Nora. "You got a lot to say about the wind," he said tightly. "Why don't you take the shot?" Every candidate froze. But Nora didn't take the bait. She just leaned the broom gently against the wall, dusted her palms, and walked down the line until she stopped beside Bird. The young man stiffened. "Ma'am, I." "SH8, her voice was calm. "Stop chasing flags." He blinked. "What?" She crouched beside him, eyes still on the mirage. "Read the shimmer above the rocks, that's your truth." He hesitated. "But my app." "Forget the app." Her tone was quiet but final. "Trust the dirt." Her fingers moved with slow precision, adjusting his rifle by millimeters, the way someone moves who knows exactly what they're doing. She nudged his elbow in, corrected his scope angle, pressed 2 fingers lightly into his shoulder. Every movement whispered experience. The rest of the line was dead silent now, watching. Bird breathed out, eyes wide. "Don't rush," she murmured. "See how the shimmer leans left, then pulls right near the shelf." He nodded barely. That's your second step. Wait. Pause. Now break. The rifle cracked, and for the first time all day Steele sang. A clear, echoing ping rolled across the plateau. The entire firing line froze. Bird didn't move, didn't breathe. He just stared through the scope, disbelieving, watching the plate at 1,600 yards sway gently in the wind. No one spoke. Then someone whispered, "She called it." Another that was dead on. Riker's face went still, unreadable. But behind that rigid posture, a flicker of something else moved. Respect, maybe even awe. The silence stretched. Wind hissed across the range. And then quietly Nora said, "See, dirt doesn't lie." She stood, brushed off her knees, and picked up the broom again. No pride, no smirk, just that calm steadiness that said she'd done this before too many times to count. Behind her, whispers grew. The photo, the tattoo, the old rifle case, the pieces were coming together. They didn't know the full story yet. Not the battles, not the name she'd carried once, the name whispered in ranger circles like a legend. But they would, because the wind had shifted and it was starting to speak. What happens to silence when respect replaces laughter? Nobody knew how long they stood frozen after that shot. The echo of steel still seemed to hum in the air, stretching thin between disbelief and awe. Even the wind, usually so unforgiving, seemed to quiet, as if it too was listening. Bird stayed pressed to the stock, breathing hard. His hands trembled slightly, though he didn't know why. He wasn't scared, not exactly. It was something else. The kind of quiet shock that comes when you realize you've just touched perfection, even if it wasn't yours alone. He turned his head slowly toward her. She hadn't moved an inch. Just stood there, broom in hand, gaze fixed downrange like the target still had more to say. "Hit confirmed," one candidate whispered. The words broke the trance. Then another voice, that was her call. Ramos, who'd been laughing the loudest earlier, swallowed hard. His voice cracked. No way that was luck. The silence around the firing line wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy, the kind that sits on your shoulders, that demands you remember what you just saw. Riker finally spoke, again. Bird blinked, "Sergeant." "You heard me, same shot, same hold." Bird nodded, set back behind the glass and lined up the scope, but now everything felt different. His breathing slowed, his muscles settled. The dirt no longer looked like chaos. It was rhythm, movement, language. He fired. Another ring. This time softer, not disbelief but confirmation, proof that the first hadn't been luck. A quiet murmur rippled through the line. Not laughter, not gossip, just the sound of pride slowly deflating and turning into something better, humility. Riker stood still, jaw working. He wasn't angry anymore, just thoughtful. He looked at the small woman beside Bird, her expression calm, her eyes distant. She didn't look like someone seeking credit. She looked like someone remembering something far away. "Ma'am," he said finally, voice lower than before, "how'd you see that?" Nora didn't look at him. "You're watching flags. Wind doesn't care about flags." Riker frowned slightly. "Then what should they be watching?" "The dirt," she said simply. "Always the dirt, it tells the truth." He didn't argue, he couldn't. The candidates were still whispering to each other, small pieces of her forming in their minds. The tattoo, the notebook, the way she spoke like someone who'd been in the fight longer than any of them had been alive. Bird leaned back from his rifle, still trying to understand. "You've done this before, haven't you?" he asked softly. She smiled faintly, "A few times." He hesitated. "Were you a sniper?" Her eyes flicked toward him, and for the first time he caught the faintest glint of something in them. Not pride, not anger, just a memory she didn't want to open. "Once," she said, then she picked up the broom again. "A long time ago." She turned, and for a moment the light caught her face just right, the fine lines around her eyes, the slight tightening of her jaw when the wind brushed past. There was weariness there, but also something unbreakable. Ramos watched her walk away and muttered under his breath, "What the hell?" "Shut up," Bird said quietly. "Just shut up." It wasn't anger, it was reverence. Riker let them have their silence. For once, he didn't bark orders. He just watched her too, broom swinging lightly, dust curling up around her boots like the ground itself bowed to her steadiness. For the first time that day, the range felt alive again. The shots that followed, shaky, uncertain, began to find rhythm. Not all hit steel, most didn't, but they were closer now, tighter. The men were seeing differently, not just aiming but observing, listening. When Riker finally called a break, the candidates didn't bolt for the shade or reach for their phones like usual. They stayed on the line, watching the woman who was sweeping brass into neat rows. "Sergeant," Bird said quietly, "who is she?" Riker didn't answer right away. "Don't know," he admitted, "but I'm starting to think I should." Out past the line of Humvees, a truck door slammed. Someone was arriving. The candidates didn't notice at first. They were still whispering about her, turning rumor into legend one sentence at a time. But Riker heard it, the rhythm of boots on gravel, heavy, steady, confident. He turned. Major Dan Haskins stepped onto the range like a man walking into a memory. His shadow stretched long in the Wyoming sun, cutting across the gravel like a scar. He was tall, his uniform crisp, but his eyes were those of someone who'd seen too much to care about appearances. He scanned the firing line once, then his gaze caught on her. And he stopped walking. For a heartbeat, his face went still, then his lips parted in disbelief. "Delgado," he said. Every candidate froze. The tone in his voice wasn't casual recognition. It was reverent, like a name pulled from a war story that still haunted him. Nora turned slowly. The broom bristles dragged a faint line through the dust. She gave him a small nod, her expression unreadable. "Major," she said softly. Haskins took a slow step forward, shaking his head. "Nora Feathers Delgado, I thought you were long gone." The range went completely still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Ramos's jaw dropped. Bird blinked hard. The words Feathers Delgado echoed through their minds like a name they'd heard somewhere before, whispered in briefings, old Ranger folklore, late-night training stories that always started with, "There was this sniper once." Riker frowned, looking between them. "Feathers." Haskins turned toward the firing line, his voice low but sharp. "You boys don't have a clue who you're standing in front of, do you?" No one answered. "This woman," he said, pointing toward Nora, "was one of the best sniper instructors this regiment ever had. You think you know how to read wind. You don't. Not until you've seen her work." The silence that followed was absolute. Bird felt something in his chest tighten, shame, awe, something heavy and wordless. He looked at Nora again, at the quiet steadiness in her stance. Haskins's voice softened, turning reflective. "Back in Afghanistan, Sparwin Gar storm rolled in out of nowhere. Visibility dropped to 50 yards. Whole platoon pinned down. Wind tore up everything. Radios dead, compasses spinning. Couldn't see a damn thing." He paused, his jaw flexed. But she sat there, calm as you please, read the mirage, felt the dirt, listened to the air itself. Guided fire through that storm one correction at a time, saved the whole platoon. The air around the line thickened with disbelief and respect. Nora didn't move, didn't confirm it, didn't deny it either. The candidates who had laughed earlier were staring at her now like she was something out of myth, a ghost from a war they'd only heard about in stories. Riker's face had changed too. His sharpness had drained into quiet understanding. He looked down at the ground, then back up and slowly stepped forward. "Major," he said carefully, "if she's who you say she is." "She is," Haskins said simply. Riker nodded once. Then, without a word, he turned to Nora and stood at attention. His salute cracked through the still air like a rifle shot. The sound of his palm hitting his cover echoed. The men on the line scrambled up, unsure at first, then one by one following his lead. Salutes rose in a perfect wave down the line. Nora stood silent through it all. No pride, no surprise, just a faint nod, eyes steady, as if the gesture wasn't for her but for something bigger, something long gone. Haskins lowered his hand first, his tone softer now. "You still carry that rifle feather." Her gaze lingered downrange for a moment, then she nodded once. "Truck bed." He smiled faintly, something sad behind it. "Then let them see what wind really looks like." For a heartbeat, it felt like time folded in on itself. The same plateau, the same wind, the same woman who'd once turned a battlefield into a classroom. Nora set the broom down against the wall. The motion was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. Dust drifted through the air like smoke. Without a word, she walked toward her old pickup. Every step echoed on the gravel. The men watched her go, not daring to speak. She flipped the tarp back. The sound of the latch clicking open was louder than any gunshot. And when she lifted the old M24 from its case, something in the air changed. It wasn't just a rifle, it was history in her hands. The stock was worn, paint chipped, sling frayed, but it fit against her shoulder with the kind of grace that only comes when you've carried it through too many nights that ended with silence instead of applause. She turned back toward the range, and for a moment the light hit her feather tattoo again, a whisper of the past catching sunlight. Birds swallowed hard, the others couldn't even speak. They were about to witness something they'd tell for the rest of their lives. Because that day, on a wind-battered range in Wyoming, the woman they'd mocked for sweeping brass was about to remind them what experience sounds like when it rings against steel. And the wind, for once, was on her side. What does silence sound like right before history repeats itself? For a long time, no one moved. The range was frozen in a kind of reverence, rifles resting in the dirt, helmets catching the sun, breaths held tight. All eyes were on the woman walking back toward them, rifle cradled in her arms like it belonged there, like it always had. Nora Delgado looked smaller up close, almost fragile, but the rifle erased all of that. It straightened her posture, pulled her shoulders square, made her presence fill the space in a way no rank or badge could. She didn't walk like a guest or a relic. She walked like gravity had shifted back in her favor. Major Haskins stood aside, arms crossed, a faint smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. It wasn't amusement. It was memory, quiet, weighted, a man watching a ghost step out of the past. Staff Sergeant Riker had gone silent too. The same man who barked orders like thunder now just watched, his jaw locked, his chest rising slow. Somewhere between disbelief and respect, he understood that this wasn't training anymore. This was something sacred. The candidates, Bird, Ramos, and the rest, stood like statues, their boots rooted to the dirt. Their earlier laughter hung in the air like old smoke, the kind that sticks even when you wish it wouldn't. Nora set the rifle case down beside the firing line. She ran her hand over the stock, thumb tracing a deep scratch near the cheek rest, a scar like her own. The wind brushed through her hair, tugging the brim of her cap just enough to reveal a glimpse of gray at her temples. "Still breathes," she murmured. No one answered. She lowered herself into the prone position, elbows grinding into the gravel. No shooting mat, no pad, just skin, bone, and dust. Her movements were deliberate, economical, nothing wasted, nothing uncertain. She slid around into the chamber. The sound, that sharp, metallic click, cut through the air like a heartbeat returning after too long a pause. "Range 1600, she asked. Riker nodded once. "Wind?" "Cross 2.7, maybe 3. She smiled faintly. "Maybe," she echoed. Bird crouched beside her, his voice quiet. "Ma'am, you sure you want to shoot? Wind?" "Perfect," she said, cutting him off gently. It's honest today." Her cheek found the stock. One eye closed, the other stared down the scope, not squinting, not straining, just seeing. Through the glass, the world stretched out in slow motion. The shimmer danced above the rocks, curling and folding in 3 layers. Flags told one story, dust told another. The air itself whispered in a language only she still remembered. Behind her, the young soldiers barely breathed. Major Haskins' voice carried low, more to himself than anyone else. "We called her Feather because she could read the wind like a book, said the air talked to her. Maybe it still does." Ramos swallowed hard. "You're serious?" Haskins didn't answer. He didn't have to. Nora's finger rested on the trigger, not pressing, just feeling it. Her breath came slow, deep, almost soundless. The plateau fell away around her, the voices, the wind, the sun, all gone. Only the shimmer and the steel existed now. In her mind, another place flickered to life. A memory she'd buried so deep she thought time had covered it for good. A sandstorm, Afghanistan, Sparwin Gar. She was there again, lying flat in the dirt while the world screamed around her. The wind had been a beast that day, sand ripping skin, ripping breath, turning the world into a blur of dust and fear. Radios dead, men shouting over the roar, no visibility, just chaos. She felt it then too, that same stillness beneath the noise. That faint pull in the air that told her exactly where to look, where the next threat was hiding, where the shot would land. Her hands remembered before her mind did. The weight of the rifle, the tiny muscle adjustments, the rhythm of her pulse counting wind instead of seconds. "Left hold 7 mils, she whispered now, almost to herself. Riker frowned. "Wind's not that strong." "It will be," she said softly. He fell silent. The candidates leaned in, waiting for the sound that would end the silence, the shot that would decide whether she was legend or just story. Nora exhaled. Her finger tightened, slow and steady, not pulling, pressing. The rifle barked. The recoil nudged her shoulder like an old friend. A half-second later, ping! Steel sang. The sound wasn't just noise, it was release. A ripple of disbelief swept through the line. Bird's mouth fell open. Ramos muttered something that might have been a prayer. Riker blinked hard, the corner of his lip twitching like he'd just seen something he couldn't explain. The plate at 1600 swung wide in the wind. Haskins smiled quietly. "Still breathes," he echoed. But Nora wasn't done. She cycled the bolt, chambered another round, and spoke without looking up. "Watch the shimmer this time." The young men dropped into kneeling positions behind her, trying to see what she saw. The mirage bent, twisted, invisible to most eyes but alive to hers. "Wind cuts high near the shelf," she murmured. "Hold left 6 pointate, aim just under the top edge." Bird whispered, "How the hell does she?" "Quiet," Riker said. Another shot cracked. Another ring. This one cleaner, sharper, perfect. The candidates stared downrange like they'd just seen the laws of physics rewrite themselves. Nora lifted her head slightly, eyes still through the scope. "That's how you talk to the dirt," she said quietly. The murmur spread again, low and reverent. Ramos, who had joked first, had tears glinting near his eyes he didn't bother to hide. Bird sat back on his heels, whispering, "She's not reading the wind. She's listening to it." Riker turned his gaze toward the targets, then back to her. "That's damn near art." She smiled faintly. "It's patience." The applause came suddenly, unplanned, raw. Boots scraped, hands clapped, voices rose. It wasn't loud enough to drown the wind, but it filled the space like sunlight through storm clouds. Riker, standing stiff, finally gave in a single nod, slow and respectful. Nora rolled to her side, cleared the chamber, and laid the rifle down carefully. Not like a trophy, like a companion. She rose to her feet, dust clinging to her knees, and glanced around at the faces watching her, young, proud, humbled. You can spend your life chasing data, she said softly, voice carrying just enough for everyone to hear. Or you can learn to feel what's already there. The earth tells you everything. You just have to listen. Bird stood, eyes locked on her. Ma'am, how did you learn that? Nora took a slow breath. The Wyoming air filled her lungs, dry, sharp, honest. By missing, she said simply, a lot, and by losing things that don't miss you back. The words hung there, soft, heavy, almost painful. Nobody spoke after that. Ramos looked away, blinking hard. Riker's jaw flexed, his own memories surfacing uninvited. Even Haskins seemed quieter, the pride in his eyes shaded by something else, sorrow maybe, nostalgia. Nora turned, began walking back toward the truck. The rifle hung at her side, the sling worn smooth against her palm. The sun caught the faded feather tattoo again, glinting faintly as she moved. Behind her, the soldiers still stood in stunned silence. She reached the truck, slid the rifle back into its case, and closed the latches with care. The metallic snap sounded final, like sealing up a chapter of her life she hadn't meant to reopen. When she turned back, Bird was still watching her. "Thank you," he said quietly. She shook her head. "Don't thank me, thank the wind. It taught me everything I know." He frowned, not sure how to answer that. She smiled faintly. "And next time you miss, don't curse the wind. Listen to it. It's trying to help you." Riker finally stepped forward, voice low but steady. "Delgado," he said, and for the first time his tone carried nothing but respect. "You just rewrote every lesson plan I've got." She chuckled softly. "Then start teaching patience instead of pride." He nodded, almost smiling. "Fair enough." As she passed him, she added, "And remind them respect doesn't wear rank." Riker's throat worked. He managed a quiet, "Yes, ma'am." She paused, gave him a long look. "I'm not ma'am, Sergeant, just Nora." Then she picked up her broom again. The sound of bristles scraping over gravel seemed louder than gunfire now, steady, grounding, real. The candidates went back to their rifles eventually, but none of them shot right away. They just sat there, adjusting scopes, breathing slow, feeling the air on their faces like it was something holy. Bird looked downrange and whispered to himself, 3 steps. The wind answered, soft, steady, indifferent, as if agreeing with her. Out near the ammo shed, Nora swept brass into a neat line. The same motion as always, but the air around her had changed. The same men who'd mocked her an hour ago now avoided stepping where she'd cleaned, as if the dirt there meant something sacred. Major Haskins turned toward Riker, voice quiet. "She'll never tell them the whole story." Riker nodded. "Would you?" Haskins smiled sadly. "No, but I'd remember it every time the wind picked up." The sun dipped lower, light scattering gold across the plateau. Shadows stretched long. The steel plates downrange still swayed gently in the fatting wind, small echoes of her precision, her history, her silence. And among all the rifles, all the gear, all the noise of military training, it was the woman with the broom who stood out, not because she'd hit steel, but because she'd done it without trying to prove anything. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. What do you do after you've seen a ghost pick up a rifle? By late afternoon, the wind began to ease. The range that had once sounded like a storm of frustration now sat in uneasy quiet. The sun slid lower, dragging the light across the gravel in long, amber strokes. The day was over, but no one left right away. The young candidates lingered in small groups, talking in hushed tones, their laughter gone, replaced by a reverent sort of curiosity. Every few minutes, 1 or 2 of them would glance toward the edge of the pad where Nora Delgado stood sweeping brass into a neat pile. She moved the same way she had that morning, calm, steady, invisible if you didn't know better. The same broom, the same rhythm, but the air around her wasn't the same anymore. Even silence seemed to make room for her now. Staff Sergeant Riker watched from a few yards away, arms folded, a faint frown of thought between his eyes. He trained hundreds of candidates in his time, taught them wind calls, patience, posture, all the usual lessons. But what she'd done today had gone deeper. She hadn't taught them how to shoot. She'd shown them how to see. He walked over slowly, his boots crunching against the gravel. "You planning to start teaching again?" he asked quietly. She didn't look up. Teaching never stops, it just changes uniforms. Riker let out a short breath that might have been a laugh. That's one way to put it. She finished sweeping a line of spent casings, brushed her hand on her pant leg and leaned against the broom. "They'll remember the shot," she said, "but it's not the shot that matters." He nodded. "I figured you'd say something like that." She glanced at him. "You didn't believe me earlier." "No," he admitted, "I didn't." Her gaze softened. "That's all right. Belief isn't required, respect is." For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them hummed with a kind of mutual understanding that soldiers recognize instantly. The quiet truce between those who have both been broken and rebuilt by the same kind of pain. Finally, Riker said, "Major Haskins told me a bit about Sparwin Gar, about what you did there." Nora's eyes drifted toward the horizon. "That was a long time ago." "You saved a platoon." She shook her head slowly. "No, I saved what was left." Riker started to say something but stopped. There was something in her tone, not regret exactly, but weight. The kind that doesn't go away with medals or promotions. The sound of gravel shifting behind them broke the moment. Byrd approached, his rifle slung, expression uncertain but determined. "Ma'am," he said carefully. Nora looked up, brow raised. "You don't need to ma'am me, kid, just talk." He nodded quickly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I just wanted to thank you again for earlier." She smiled faintly. "You hit the steel, thank yourself." He shook his head. "No, I didn't, I just did what you told me." Her voice was calm. "And now you know what listening sounds like." Byrd hesitated. "If you don't mind me asking, why'd you stop?" "Stop what?" "Shooting, serving, all of it." The broom paused in her hand. For a second, her eyes seemed far away, like she was watching something play out on the horizon that no one else could see. "Because sometimes," she said softly, "the cost of being right is too high." Byrd frowned. "I don't get it." "You will," she said, her voice not unkind, "if you stay long enough." She went back to sweeping, her silence final in the way that said the conversation was over. Byrd stood there, unsure, his youth and curiosity clashing with the weight of her calm. Riker gave him a look that said, "Let it go." But that night, Byrd couldn't let it go. When darkness settled over Camp Guernsey, the desert cooled fast. The heat of the day bled into a sharp, dry chill. The wind didn't roar now, it whispered. The flags out on the range hung limp, and the steel targets caught the moonlight like small, distant ghosts. The barracks lights flickered one by one. Laughter from the younger soldiers floated out briefly before the night swallowed it. But Byrd didn't sleep. He found himself outside, hands shoved into his pockets, eyes drawn toward the faint glow of a lantern near the ammo shed. Nora was still there. She sat on a low crate, her broom resting beside her, notebook open on her lap. The light flickered across her face, tracing every line, every scar softened by time. Her pencil moved slowly, marking numbers in the margins, neat, exact, ritualistic. Byrd hovered a few feet away, unsure whether to interrupt. "You can come closer," she said without looking up. "I don't bite." He smiled awkwardly, stepping into the lantern light. "You're still working." "Not working," she said, "remembering." He glanced at the notebook. "That's your old data book, right?" "Old," she said with a half smile, "and stubborn. Keeps reminding me of what the dirt taught me." Byrd hesitated, then sat down on the ground across from her. The silence stretched. Finally he asked, "Was that picture in the back, was that you?" She didn't answer right away. She turned a page, adjusted the lantern wick, then looked up. Her eyes were steady but softer now. "Yeah," she said, "that was me and a friend." "Where?" "Afghanistan. A long, ugly ridge nobody remembers by name. We called it the Gray Line." He leaned forward slightly. The other person, was he a sniper too? Nora's hand stilled on the page. For a second she didn't breathe. Then she nodded once. "Yeah," she said quietly. "He was better than me. Taught me everything I knew about patience, about reading wind, reading silence." "What happened to him?" She looked down at her notebook. Her pencil tapped once against the margin. "He stopped missing," she said. "And the day he stopped missing was the last day he ever fired a shot." Bird frowned, confused, but the way she said it made him not want to ask more. The wind picked up again, soft and cold. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote called. Nora closed the notebook, set it beside her. "You know, Bird," she said, "people think shooting about control. It's not. It's about surrender. You don't fight the wind, you work with it. You let it tell you what it wants. That's life too." He nodded slowly, trying to understand. "You're young," she continued. "You think missing is failure, but missing teaches you the most. It humbles you, makes you see things you'd ignore otherwise." He swallowed hard. "You still miss?" She smiled faintly. "Every day." The words were simple, but they hit deeper than he expected. They sat there in silence for a long time. The lantern flickered. Crickets hummed. The smell of gun oil and dust mixed in the night air. When Bird finally spoke, his voice was soft. "I didn't mean to make fun of you earlier." "I know," she said. "You were trying to laugh before you broke. Soldiers do that." He looked at her, surprised. "You don't seem like someone who breaks." She met his eyes, steady. "Everyone breaks. The trick is learning how to rebuild quiet." Her gaze drifted upward toward the stars scattered across the dark Wyoming sky. "When I left," she said after a while, "I thought I was done, thought I'd earned peace. But peace doesn't come from leaving things behind. It comes from learning to carry them differently." Bird didn't answer. He didn't know how to. He just sat there, feeling smaller and wiser at the same time. Finally, Nora pushed herself to her feet, brushing the dust from her pants. She picked up her broom and her notebook. "Get some sleep, Bird," she said gently. "You'll need it. Tomorrow the wind'll change again." He stood too. "Do you ever get tired of it?" "The wind?" she asked. He nodded. She smiled, that small, weary kind of smile that carries both sadness and understanding. "No, the wind reminds me I'm still alive." Then she turned and walked into the dark, her silhouette blending with the faint outline of the ammo shed, the lantern light flickering behind her until it went out completely. Bird stood there for a long time, listening. The wind picked up just enough to carry a whisper across the empty range, a soft rattle of brass, a sigh through the dust. He looked downrange toward the faint shine of steel plates catching the moonlight and whispered to himself, 3 steps. And for just a second, he thought he heard a faint echo, the distant, impossible sound of steel ringing again in the dark. How do you teach men to see what they refuse to look at? Morning came slow to Camp Guernsey, the kind of dawn that didn't rise, it crept. The plateau sat half-drowned in fog, the horizon a pale bruise of pink and gray. The air was cold enough to bite, and every sound carried boots scuffing gravel, zippers, low murmurs. The candidates filed out to the range, their breath clouding in the chill. No one joked this time. No one glanced lazily at their screens or laughed about broom ladies. They just set up in silence, checking rifles and optics like men who'd seen something the day before that shifted the ground under their feet. Staff Sergeant Riker stood near the firing line, clipboard under one arm, coffee in the other, but his usual sharpness was gone. He looked up at the rising sun, then toward the truck parked by the ammo shed. The tarp had been pulled back halfway, the old M24 still there, half glinting under the morning light. The door of the shed creaked. Nora Delgado stepped out, same faded cap, same quiet stride. No ceremony, no announcement. Just the woman who'd turned silence into music the day before. She carried her broom in one hand, her notebook in the other. The men straightened instinctively. Riker cleared his throat. "Morning, ma'am," he caught himself. "Morning, Nora." She gave a small nod, eyes scanning the firing line. "Morning, Sergeant. Wind's lazy today. You'll have a few hours before it decides what it wants." Bird was already lying prone behind his rifle. When she walked by, he offered a nervous smile. She didn't return it, but she gave a small nod that somehow meant more. Riker walked beside her as she moved down the line. "They're ready for another go," he said. "Figured you might observe again." Nora stopped. Her gaze stayed on the distant targets, barely visible through the haze. "Observe," she repeated quietly. Riker hesitated. "Or instruct if you're willing." The words hung there heavy. She hadn't taught in years. Not since Afghanistan. Not since the storm and the ridge and the one shot that had saved a platoon but cost her something she'd never put into words. She stared downrange for a long time before she spoke. "All right," she said finally, "but not like you think." Riker frowned slightly, meaning. She turned toward him, her voice even but sure. "You can't teach them how to shoot until you teach them how to see." He nodded slowly, "Then start there." Nora set her broom down against the wall and stepped onto the firing pad. The men straightened automatically, eyes on her. "All right," she said, her tone quiet but commanding. "You've got your rifles, your scopes, your apps. Now put them away." A ripple of confusion ran down the line. One candidate blinked. "Ma'am, you mean?" "I mean off," she said. "Screens down, batteries out, eyes up." Reluctant hands moved. Devices clicked. A few exchanged uneasy looks. Riker folded his arms, watching. He didn't interfere. Nora walked slowly behind the row of prone rifles, boots crunching in rhythm. "You've all been staring through glass too long," she said. "You see data, not distance. You trust numbers because they don't argue back. But the land," she paused, crouching beside one rifle, "the land never lies, you just don't listen." Her hand brushed the dirt beside the rifle, fingertips tracing faint ripples left by the wind. "See that?" Bird leaned over, frowning. "What?" "The shimmer," she said. "It's faint now. Means the wind's low and steady. If it curls left near the ridge, your bullet will drift half a mil, but if it flattens," she snapped her fingers softly, "your shot'll sail clean." She looked up, scanning their faces. "The dirt talks. You just have to let go of what you think you know long enough to hear it." The men listened, silent. Her tone wasn't harsh. It was something else, intimate, almost poetic. The way someone speaks when they're remembering instead of lecturing. "Every place has its own language," she continued. "Deserts, mountains, valleys. This range, it hums when the air warms. Watch the flags all you want, but if you don't feel that hum, you'll always miss." Bird's eyes narrowed, studying the horizon. He saw it now, faint lines rising from the dirt, moving like heat snakes. She saw him notice and nodded slightly. "Good, don't just look, see." Riker shifted his weight, jaw tight. There was something about watching her teach, the ease, the quiet conviction that reminded him how much noise he'd let into his own training. Nora crouched beside Ramos next, who had his rifle tilted awkwardly. "You're fighting it," she said. He frowned, "The wind." "No, yourself." He blinked. She adjusted the angle of his rifle by a fraction, then pointed toward the far rocks. "There. That shimmers your path, trust it, not the last miss, not what you expect, just that." Ramos swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am." "Don't call me ma'am." "Yes, Nora." She smiled faintly. "Better." He took the shot. Steel rang. The sound rolled across the plateau, clear and bright. He looked up in disbelief. "I actually—" "Don't talk," she said, almost kindly. "Listen to the echo. That's the range telling you thank you." Laughter broke through the line, not mockery this time, but relief, joy, something clean. Nora straightened, dust brushing off her knees. She glanced toward the rising sun, the warmth now cutting through the morning chill. For the first time in years, she felt the old rhythm again, the connection between breath, ground, and purpose. But with it came the ghosts. Every time the rifle cracked, she could almost hear the echo of that sandstorm from long ago. The storm that had swallowed her whole and left her rebuilding piece by piece. Haskins had told part of the story yesterday, not all of it. He'd left out the detail that haunted her most. The man in the photograph, the other sniper, hadn't made it off that ridge. He'd been her partner, her spotter, her teacher. The one who'd told her once, if you stop listening to the wind, you stop living. When he'd fallen, she'd sworn she'd never pick up a rifle again. But life, like wind, doesn't honor promises made in grief. It just shifts until you find yourself facing it again. She forced her mind back to the range. Bird was lining up another shot, breath slow, hands steady. "Don't hold your breath," she called softly. "Let the shot happen, don't force it." He fired, steel sang again. She nodded, almost proud. "Better." Riker moved closer. "They're learning faster with you than they did with me all week." She glanced at him, half smiling. "They're not learning from me, Sergeant. They're remembering something they already knew, before the apps, before the numbers, before they started thinking too much." He chuckled quietly. "You sound like one of those old-timers who hates tech." "I don't hate it," she said. "I just remember when men trusted their instincts more than their batteries." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Fair." By noon, the range echoed with clean hits. The air felt lighter. Each shot carried not frustration but rhythm, a kind of peace found in discipline. Nora walked the line slowly, eyes scanning the shimmering air, her notebook tucked under one arm. Her heart was steady, but her chest felt tight. Each impact of steel reminded her of something, of who she'd been, who she'd lost, and the silence that had followed. She hadn't planned to teach again, but maybe the wind had other plans. When the session ended, Riker called for a break. The candidates lowered their rifles, sweat streaking their faces, but their eyes glowed. Even Ramos, who'd spent most of the week cracking jokes, was quiet now, his grin replaced by something like pride. Bird approached Nora again, hesitant but determined. "Can I ask something?" She nodded. "When you said the cost of being right was too high, what did you mean?" Her eyes lifted to his, steady, unreadable. Then she looked out across the range. "When you spend long enough watching through a scope," she said slowly, "you start forgetting there are people on the other end. You start thinking of wind and distance and math instead of hearts and homes. Sometimes being right means you hit exactly what you aimed at, and it still feels wrong." Bird swallowed hard, words catching in his throat. She turned back to him, softer now. "That's why you listen to the wind, it keeps you human." The silence after that felt different, not heavy, but sacred. Riker approached, clipboard forgotten at his side. "Delgado," he said quietly, "you should be the one running this range." She smiled. "No, I'm right where I need to be." He looked around, the men, the light, the swaying flags. "You really think this is where you belong?" Her voice was calm. "The world doesn't always need heroes, Sergeant. Sometimes it just needs reminders." He nodded slowly. "And you're one hell of a reminder." Nora picked up her broom again, resting it lightly on her shoulder. "Then my job here, done for today." The men watched her walk away, the same small figure they'd ignored 2 days ago, and none of them saw a cleaner or a groundskeeper anymore. They saw a teacher, a soldier, a truth they hadn't known they'd forgotten. As she disappeared down the path toward the supply yard, the wind picked up again, faint, teasing, carrying her words back across the plateau. "Trust the dirt," it seemed to whisper. "It doesn't lie." What do you remember most when the war refuses to leave you, the noise, or the silence that followed? That night, the wind at Camp Guernsey changed again. It came down off the ridgeline cold and slow, carrying a hum that only she seemed to notice. The recruits were asleep. The range was empty, but Nora Delgado sat awake in her truck, a lantern glowing dim beside her. Her hands rested on the old rifle case across her lap. The latches were still dusty from the day's shooting. She traced them with her thumb like they were scars. She hadn't meant to open it again. Not really. But once her hands had remembered the weight, the smell of gun oil and grit, something old inside her had started breathing again. And that was dangerous. She leaned her head back against the seat, eyes half closed, and the present began to blur. The Wyoming air dissolved into heat and dust, into the memory she'd spent years trying to bury. Afghanistan, Spurwingar. It started with the storm. She could still feel it, whipping sand like razors across her skin, blinding every lens and compass. It was supposed to be a simple overwatch, 2 days on the ridge, watch the valley, keep an eye on movement near the dry wadi. But nothing in Afghanistan ever stayed simple. By dawn of the second day, visibility dropped to near zero. Radio static screamed in her ear. The horizon was gone, swallowed by beige chaos. She and her spotter, Staff Sergeant Keller, huddled under a torn camouflage net. Wind tore at everything. The scope was useless. You couldn't see 10 feet ahead. They should have pulled out. But the call came through, broken and panicked. A platoon trapped in the valley below, ambushed, pinned down by mortar fire they couldn't even see. The last voice through the static said, "Anyone with eyes, talk us home." Keller looked at her. His face was half hidden by a shemagh, dust caked in the lines around his eyes. "You hearing this?" She nodded. "We can't see anything." "Neither can they," he said. "That's the point." She adjusted her scope anyway. The glass was fogged, smeared with dust, worthless. She wiped it, squinted, still nothing. The world was a brown blur. The sound of gunfire rolled faint through the storm, muffled by distance and wind. She flipped open her data book, trying to calculate holds. Worthless. The air density was shifting every few seconds. "We can't shoot blind," she muttered. Keller was watching the dust swirl. "You don't need sight," he said. "You've got instinct. You always did." She turned toward him, frustrated. "Instinct doesn't find targets through this." He smiled behind the cloth, then stopped looking. She stared at him, then at the storm, and slowly began to understand. She lay flat, cheek against the stock, eyes half closed. The rifle wasn't just a weapon. It was an extension of everything she'd ever learned. The wind became sound. The sand became pattern. Movement wasn't something she saw, it was something she felt. The air carried information in its pressure, its hum, its rhythm. She exhaled slowly. "2 clicks right," she whispered. Keller adjusted the scope. "Range." 1,000, maybe 980. Hard to tell. He nodded, trusting her, always trusting her. The radio crackled again, voices breaking through static. "Taking fire, need direction. Anyone out there?" She steadied her breathing, reading the swirl of dust through her scope. Every shift in the storm told her something. Where the sand lifted higher, the wind hit harder. Where it flattened, there was cover. "There," she said. "That's where they're firing from." Keller followed her line but saw nothing. "You sure?" She nodded. "Trust me." He relayed the coordinates. The platoon below adjusted their fire. Moments later, faint through the roar of the storm, the sound of steel and earth splitting. Direct hit. The radio came alive. "Impact good, keep calling it." Keller laughed, clapping her shoulder. "Feather, you crazy bastard, you're reading a storm." She smiled, adrenaline sharpening her voice. "Wind's got 3 steps today." And that became their rhythm. Shot after shot, she read the invisible using sound, sand, vibration. No math, no glass, no flag. Just instinct and the earth beneath her elbows. Every correction saved a life below. Every call silenced a gun that had been tearing her people apart. Hours passed like that. The storm didn't break. It just changed shape, swirling like a living thing around them. At some point, Keller stopped talking. He was beside her one moment, his hand steady on the tripod, and then the air ripped apart with the sharp, impossible whistle of incoming. The impact threw her sideways. The world went white, then black, then soundless. When she came to, the wind had shifted again. The storm still howled, but quieter now. The ridge around her was cratered. The rifle lay half buried in sand. Keller was gone. For a long time she didn't move, didn't breathe. When she finally found him a few yards downhill, half covered by dust, his hand was still gripping the edge of the tripod. His eyes were open, but there was no wind left in them. She sat beside him for a long time, sand beating against her face. Her mind kept replaying the moment he'd said, "Stop looking." The radio crackled again, voices calling for coordinates, direction, salvation. And she gave it. Even through the tears, through the blood in her mouth, through the ache that felt like the earth itself had broken open, she called every correction. She didn't stop until the platoon below radioed in all clear. When the storm finally broke the next morning and the valley lay still again, they found her sitting beside Keller's body, her rifle across her lap, scope cracked, data book open to the last line she'd written before the explosion. Trust the dirt. After that mission, the regiment gave her medals, words, handshakes. They called her legend. They called her feather. But all she could hear was the wind. She left the army not long after. No ceremony, no goodbyes. She packed the rifle in its battered case, tucked the data book in her back pocket, and drove until the roads turned quiet. Wyoming found her by accident, a small post, a maintenance job, a chance to blend into background noise, a place where she could sweep brass instead of carrying it. And for years that was enough. Until yesterday. Until a group of young men started missing the same target again and again, and the wind, the same old voice she tried to ignore, whispered her name. Her eyes opened slowly, the present bleeding back in. The lantern hissed softly in the truck cab. Outside, the wind rustled faintly through the flags. She sat there for a long time, the rifle case heavy across her knees. Her fingers tightened on it once more, then released. "Stop looking," Keller's voice whispered somewhere in the back of her mind. "Just feel it." She took a slow, deep breath. Out on the range, the faintest shimmer drifted above the rocks, visible even in the dark moonlight bending over the ground. 3 layers, 3 steps. She smiled. "Still there," she whispered. The memory hurt less tonight, not because it had faded, but because it finally had somewhere to rest. Tomorrow she'd teach again, not to prove anything, not for redemption, but because wind doesn't forgive, it reminds. She turned off the lantern, the darkness folding over her like a blanket. Outside, the Wyoming air moved the same way the Afghan air once had, alive, restless, full of voices if you listened long enough. And for the first time in years, Nora Delgado didn't flinch from it. She just let it move through her like it always had. The next morning before dawn, Bird found her already on the range. She was sitting cross-legged in the dirt, the notebook open, drawing rough sketches of wind lines and rock shadows. The broom lay beside her, untouched. He stopped a few feet away. "You couldn't sleep either, huh?" She didn't look up. "Sleep's overrated. You either dream or you remember. Both get you in trouble." He smiled slightly. "You really don't like talking about yourself, do you?" She looked up at him then, calm, unguarded. "Talking, easy. Listening's rare." He nodded. "Then maybe I'll just listen." She closed the notebook and set it aside. "Then listen carefully," she said. "The wind's about to wake up." Bird tilted his head. "You can tell." "I can feel it." He stood there quietly, watching as she brushed her hand across the dirt, feeling the faint vibration of the air. "When it starts," she said softly, "it's like memory. It creeps in quiet, then takes over everything. But if you face it instead of fighting it, it'll show you what you need to see. He looked out at the range, the faint light of dawn rising behind the targets. And what do you need to see? She smiled faintly, that it was worth it. The wind picked up, slow, deliberate, brushing through their hair like an old friend returning. Bird turned to her. What was? She looked toward the far ridge, eyes distant but steady. All of it. What happens when the teacher who never asked to teach begins to change everyone around her? By the third morning, Camp Guernsey felt different. The wind still came down off the plateau in restless waves, but it no longer mocked them. It spoke. The men had started to listen. The first rays of sun cut across the range, painting the steel plates in pale gold. A dozen rifles rested in neat rows, their owners waiting, silent, focused. No chatter, no swagger, just breath and patience. Staff Sergeant Riker watched them from behind the line, arms crossed loosely instead of tight. He stopped packing 2 days ago. The candidates didn't need him to bark anymore. They were finally hearing something older than orders. Nora Delgado stood near the ammo shed, coffee steaming in her hand, notebook tucked under her arm. She looked like she'd always belonged there, though none of them could quite remember when she had started being there. Bird was already prone, cheek pressed to the stock, eyes on the horizon. He wasn't checking his app. He hadn't touched it in days. The shimmer over the rocks told him everything he needed. Ramos lay beside him, unusually quiet. His jokes had turned to questions, his arrogance to curiosity. "Feels calmer today," he murmured. Bird nodded. "Means it's about to shift. You can feel it right there." He tapped the dirt just ahead of his bipod. "The ground hums a little before it turns." Ramos squinted. "You sure?" "Trust the dirt," Bird said simply. Nora smiled faintly from behind them. They didn't notice her listening, but she heard every word. Riker stepped up beside her. "You've made believers out of them." "I didn't make anything," she said. "The wind did the work." He sipped his coffee, then glanced sideways at her. "You really think it's that simple?" "It's never simple," she said, "but it's always honest." He chuckled softly. "You and your poetry." She turned her head toward him, eyes calm. "You call it poetry, I call it survival." He couldn't argue with that. They stood in silence for a while, watching the line adjust. Shots rang out one by one, slow, methodical. Not every round hit, but none were wasted. Each miss taught something. Each correction carried intent. When the last shot faded, the echo stretched across the ridge like an exhale. Riker nodded toward Bird. "That one's got something special." "He listens," she said. "He listens because you talked." She gave a small smile. "No, he listens because he's tired of missing." Riker's expression shifted. "You ever think about coming back? Instructor school. The regiment could use someone like you again." She didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed on the distant ridge where heat was beginning to shimmer. "I gave enough," she said quietly. "The range is where I belong now." Riker started to protest but stopped. He'd learned by now not to push her. Some answers weren't open to argument. The candidates gathered around when the session ended. Their faces were red from the sun, eyes bright. For once, pride didn't look like arrogance. It looked like peace. Bird spoke for them. "Nora," he said, voice firm, "we want to thank you for all this." She set her coffee down, folded her arms loosely. "Don't thank me, thank yourselves, you listened. That's the hardest part." Ramos stepped forward, scratching the back of his neck. "You know, we were kind of idiots before." She smiled, kind of. A ripple of laughter moved through them. It felt good, clean. Bird looked at her notebook. "That thing's probably full of magic, huh?" "Just wind and mistakes," she said. "Can we?" He hesitated, unsure how to ask. "Could you maybe show us one of your old pages?" She thought about it. Then she opened the cover and flipped to a sheet near the middle, numbers faded, pencil strokes pressed deep from long nights. She held it so they could see. See those arrows, she said. Each one's a wind shift. Every change was a life saved or almost lost. But this, she pointed to a small note scribbled in the corner. Remember, stop looking. That's from the man who taught me everything. Bird frowned slightly. The one in the picture. She nodded. What happened to him? Her answer was soft. He stayed where the wind stopped. The line went quiet. No one pushed for more. Finally, she closed the notebook. You want to honor the ones who taught you, she said. Then don't talk about them. Shoot like they're still watching. The men nodded solemn. Riker cleared his throat. All right, back to positions. But his voice was gentler now, almost protective. They spread out again, movement smooth, deliberate. As the morning went on, the hits came more often. The sound of ringing steel mixed with the hum of the wind until they became one rhythm, a song the range hadn't heard in years. By midday, Haskins showed up again, his truck grinding to a halt in the gravel. He stepped out, sunglasses glinting, taking in the scene the disciplined line, the calm air, the quiet authority of the woman standing behind them. He smiled faintly. Looks like you've turned this place into a chapel. Nora gave a small shrug. When's the preacher? He laughed. You know, if you ever decided to re-enlist, I'd sign the papers myself. She shook her head, though there was warmth in it. You can't go backward, Major. Even the wind knows that. He nodded slowly, then gestured to the recruits. They're different. They were always capable, she said. They just needed to remember who they were before the noise. Haskins looked at her carefully. And you remembering who you were too. For the first time, she didn't deflect. Maybe, she said, or maybe I'm finally okay forgetting. He studied her for a moment, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope, the kind that carried orders or commendations. He handed it to her. What's this? She asked. Paperwork, he said. Officially, you're not even on the roster here. Thought maybe you'd like that fixed. She looked down at it, the government seal faint against the paper. Her thumb rested on the flap, but she didn't open it. Thank you, she said, but no. No. She handed it back. Legends belong to stories, not systems. I'm just a range hand now. He sighed, half smiling. You've always been impossible. Only to men who think everything has to make sense. He laughed quietly. Fair enough. As he walked away, Riker approached. You really turned that down. She nodded. Why? Because if I'm on the books, she said, someone'll try to own what I do. The wind doesn't report to anyone, Sergeant. He shook his head, smiling despite himself. You're something else, Delgado. The afternoon stretched on. Shots continued, steady, rhythmic, precise. The wind shifted again around 2, and they caught it before it even reached the ridge. Each man adjusted instinctively, like they'd all grown invisible strings tying them to the same pulse. Riker walked the line, calling corrections, but half the time the recruits made them before he spoke. He glanced back at Nora. You see that? She nodded. They're finally breathing with the wind instead of against it. And you? She looked downrange, expression unreadable. I'm learning to let go. When the last round fired, she called cease. The men stood, stretching, their faces lit with something deeper than pride. They'd earned a kind of quiet that didn't need words. Ramos approached her, grinning. You think the wind's proud of us yet? She tilted her head, pretending to consider it. Maybe, but don't get cocky. Wind's got an ego. It'll test you again tomorrow. He laughed, shaking his head. Guess we'll be ready. Bird lingered as the others packed up. You leaving soon? Maybe, she said. Depends if the dirt still needs sweeping. He hesitated. If you do, will we see you again? She smiled faintly. If you listen close enough, you might. He didn't understand it fully, but something in her tone told him it was both a promise and a goodbye. As the sun dipped low, the recruits loaded their gear. Riker gathered brass, watching her from the corner of his eye. When she finally picked up her broom again, he stepped closer. You know, they'll tell this story for years. She shrugged. Let them, maybe it'll keep them humble. He looked at her carefully. You ever think humility and pride can live in the same person? Her eyes softened. Only when pride's earned and humility's remembered. He nodded slowly, the words sinking in. The last truck pulled out. The range fell quiet again, just wind, dust, and the faint shimmer above the rocks. Nora stood there alone for a moment, broom in hand, eyes tracing the horizon. The light was fading, that perfect golden hour that makes everything look softer than it really is. She took a long breath, letting the air fill her lungs. It felt like the first honest breath in years. Behind her, Bird's voice called out one last time, "Hey, Nora." She turned. He raised a hand, smiling. "For what it's worth, you were right. Dirt doesn't lie." She smiled back, small but genuine. Neither does courage. Then she turned toward her truck, her figure small against the vast Wyoming sky. The wind picked up, tugging her sleeve, whispering through the feathers inked on her wrist. And as she walked away, the breeze carried one last echo, not of a rifle, not of applause, but of peace. What do you leave behind when you never meant to stay? 3 days after the wind finally calmed, the range stood empty. The brass was cleared, the steel plates repainted, the echo of gunfire replaced by silence. Camp Guernsey looked cleaner, sharper, but it felt like something had gone missing. The recruits noticed it first. No faint country music drifting from the maintenance shed. No broom tapping against the gravel. No slow voice reminding them to breathe with the land. By sunrise, Riker knew. He found the locker near the supply yard unlocked, broom leaned against the wall, name tag still taped to the door. NDLGADO. Inside was nothing but a notebook. He stared at it for a long time before picking it up. The cover was weathered, the edges bent. The same one she'd carried everywhere. He thumbed through the pages, sketches of wind patterns, scrawled notes, fragments of memory that looked half like poetry, half like data. The last entry stopped him cold. When the dirt stops humming, it's time to move on. No signature, no date. He stood there, the morning sun creeping across the concrete, and felt something tighten in his chest. Not regret, not loss exactly, but the strange ache of realizing you'd been changed by someone you never thanked properly. Bird found him a few minutes later. "She's gone, isn't she?" he asked quietly. Riker nodded. "Looks that way." Bird swallowed hard, looking out toward the ridge where they'd spent their mornings. Just like that. Just like that. They stood there for a moment, the air still. "She didn't even say goodbye," Bird said finally. Riker half smiled. "That was her goodbye, quiet's how she talks." Bird kicked at the gravel, frustration and sadness tangled together. "Feels wrong, like she deserved, I don't know, a send-off." Riker's eyes softened. "She's had enough of those." Bird looked at the notebook in his hands. "What'll you do with it?" Riker hesitated, then closed it gently. "Keep it for all of us." Bird nodded slowly. "You ever think she'll come back?" The sergeant looked out at the horizon. "Wind always does." Weeks passed. Training continued. New recruits arrived. The world kept moving, but something in the rhythm of Camp Guernsey had changed. The new guys didn't know why the veterans kept watching the dirt before shooting, or why they carried no digital wind gauges anymore. They didn't understand why Riker sometimes paused mid-briefing, closed his eyes and muttered, "Feel the hum." But Bird knew. He'd taken over helping Riker on the range unofficially. His voice was quieter now, more measured. He didn't bark corrections. He waited until the shooters stopped forcing their breath, until the silence grew long enough for learning to happen on its own. And when one of them missed, he'd kneel beside them and say, "Don't overthink it, trust the dirt." Sometimes they'd look confused, sometimes inspired, but always somehow it worked. It wasn't technique, it was presence. And that, Bird realized, was what she'd been teaching all along. It wasn't about bullets or optics or data books. It was about paying attention to the world, to yourself, to the fragile hum between motion and stillness that most people never stop long enough to hear. He still thought about her sometimes. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the camp was asleep and the sky just starting to bruise, he'd walk the ridge alone. The wind always met him there. Some mornings it was soft, almost apologetic. Other times it came roaring down like a storm, but no matter how it came, he listened. He'd close his eyes and remember her voice. Stop looking, just feel it. And he'd smile. One evening, months later, Riker sat outside the mess hall with a cigarette he wasn't supposed to have. The air was still, the sky orange and deepening to blue. Bird joined him, coffee in hand. They sat in companionable silence for a long time. You ever think about her? Bird asked quietly. Riker exhaled smoke. Every day. You think she's okay? He nodded slowly. Yeah, she's somewhere she can breathe. Bird took a sip, then leaned forward, elbows on knees. It's crazy. She wasn't even here that long, but it's like the place still feels like her. Riker smiled faintly. That's what real people do, son. They leave something behind that doesn't wear off. Bird looked out toward the range. The flags were still, the dirt untouched since the last storm. I keep thinking about what she said, about cost, about being right. Riker nodded, eyes distant. She carried a lot of ghosts. You know what happened to her out there? He hesitated, bits and pieces, enough to understand why she left. Bird waited, but Riker didn't elaborate. Finally, the young man said softly, I think she forgave herself. Riker flicked ash into the dirt. Maybe she didn't need to. Maybe she just stopped asking permission to live. They sat there until the stars came out, small white scars across the dark sky. Somewhere in the distance, the wind shifted. It came low at first, brushing across the gravel, stirring the air around their boots. Then stronger, sweeping up over the ridge, carrying with it the faintest scent of rain. Riker tilted his head, listening. You hear that? Bird nodded, yeah. He smiled faintly, almost sounds like her. Riker grinned, it is her. They both sat in silence then, letting the sound move through them. The next morning, the range came alive again. New recruits lined up, half nervous, half proud, rifles gleaming in the early light. Bird walked the line, calm and steady. His voice carried the kind of weight that doesn't need to shout. All right, he said. Forget your gadgets, forget your apps, just feel the air. The ground will tell you the rest. They looked confused. He smiled. Don't worry, you'll hear it soon enough. Riker watched from behind, arms crossed, head slightly bowed. He didn't interfere. The first shot cracked through the air, a clean hit, then another. A rhythm began to build again. Different voices now, but the same song. Bird paused, looking toward the ridge. For a moment he could almost see her there, the faint silhouette of a woman standing against the horizon, broom in hand, wind in her hair. He blinked and she was gone. But the feeling stayed. That night, long after the others turned in, Riker sat at his desk going through paperwork. The notebook, her notebook, lay beside him, its corners curled from dust and sun. He opened it to a random page. There were diagrams, sketches, little fragments of reflection. One line caught his eye. Precision isn't the absence of doubt. It's the courage to shoot anyway. He read it twice. Then he closed the book and leaned back, exhaling slowly. Outside, the wind moved through the flagpoles, making them hum like tuning forks. He smiled, eyes half closed. Still teaching, huh? He murmured. Then he turned off the lamp. Miles away, a truck rolled down a lonely desert road. Headlights cut through dust, the same dust that once hid war and now only carried silence. Nora Delgado drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the old rifle case beside her. The road stretched endless ahead, no destination, just movement. She stopped checking maps weeks ago. The wind was her compass now. When she passed through small towns, people saw only a quiet woman who didn't talk much, who smiled when she bought her coffee and tipped too much. They never saw the way she scanned the horizon. They never knew the stories her hands could tell. Sometimes she stopped at old ranges, abandoned outposts, forgotten patches of dust. She'd clean what needed cleaning, fix what could be fixed, and leave before anyone knew she'd been there. No name, no trace, just calm where there had been noise. One evening she parked by an empty field, no steel targets, no flags, just open space and dying light. She stepped out, the air warm and dry. She set up her rifle, the same one that had followed her through everything. She didn't aim at anything in particular. She just breathed. In, out. The wind whispered around her, gentle, unhurried. She smiled softly. "You found me again," she said. It brushed her cheek like an old friend's hand. For a while she just sat there, eyes on the horizon, not shooting, not training, just being. Then she packed up, brushed the dirt from her knees and stood. When she turned to leave, the air behind her shifted, a single gust sweeping across the ground, lifting the fine dust into a swirl. It shimmered briefly in the sunset, forming the faint outline of a feather before disappearing again. She didn't notice, but the land did. And somewhere far away, at a range still echoing with lessons she'd left behind, the wind carried her words again, soft, almost prayer-like. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. The breeze moved on, taking her story with it. And the world, at least that small, quiet corner of it, remembered her not as the woman who left, but as the one who listened.